The next item on our agenda will be under briefings, and it'll be a briefing on the Texas Department of Public Safety collaboration with the Austin Police Department. I'll recognize the city manager.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem, council members, before I ask Chief Chacon and Dr. Krinnigan to come up on their report, I just want to provide you some background and some context to how this partnership came to be. I began as interim city manager 9 weeks ago, and at the time, the city was and is experiencing some serious challenges. Chief among those challenges, the historic staffing crisis at the Austin Police Department. You know that I've tried to instill a bias for action in this organization, and you all gave me a charge to make changes and to make them quickly. We knew we needed to address significant issues that are unacceptable. Record high response times for calls for assistance, an increase in gun crimes, and high-profile incidents such as the street takeovers that occurred shortly after I became took place shortly after my appointment, and an expiring police contract that spurred concerns about the retirements and resignations. Given all these factors, we were presented with an opportunity to partner with DPS. And in my professional opinion, that of Chief Chacon and interim Assistant City Manager Bruce Mills, this was an absolute right move, particularly given the partnership with DPS has helped us respond to the takeovers we experienced in February and yielded 17 arrests. I think that from the information presented today, which includes the most recent data, that this is another successful partnership making an impact and making Austin safer. I recognize that acting quickly in response to the opportunity to address critical need in our community didn't allow time to normalize this with the City Council. And I'm hoping that today's presentation will provide answers to your questions that you've raised and provides assurances to the partnership that is producing results. What I can say is that I know that all of you have a sense of urgency about this situation, as I do, and given the factors before us, we wanted to launch this partnership as soon as possible. And with that, I'll turn this over to Chief Chacon. Chief.
Good morning, Mayor and Council, Mr. Manager Joseph Chacon, Chief of Police. Also with me is Dr. Jonathan Kringan, who is the Chief Data Officer for the Austin Police Department. We're going to present to you jointly on an update on the partnership between the Austin Police Department and the Texas Department of Public Safety, which actually began on March the 30th of this year. If I can get the next slide, please. So just a quick kind of overview of what we'll go through, a little bit of the background, just kind of expanding on the remarks made by the manager, how the partnership is working, the parts that we're trying to instill regarding collaboration and, importantly, transparency. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Kringan, who'll go over the data-driven approach to both traffic safety and violent crime, and then an overview of what the initial results look like right now, and then obviously leave time for questions and answers at the end. So if I can get the next slide. So with regard to the background, today, APD currently has more than 300 vacant officer positions. Just this year, in 2023, we're currently at 102 separations year to date, and that number grows every single day. We have fewer officers today than we did 15 years ago, and the city is now over 1 million people. The call load has increased commensurately. These staffing shortages combined with this rapidly growing city have created a challenge. These vacancy rates and recruiting challenges are not exclusive to Austin. We're seeing this around the state. We're seeing it around the country. And particularly here in Central Texas, whether we're talking about Austin PD, the Travis County Sheriff's Department, DPS, or any of the about 46 different law enforcement agencies that are in Central Texas, we are all competing for the same small pool of applicants. We want good, qualified people. We have to be competitive, and that is what we're trying to do as a department and as a city. But what it means realistically is these decreased staffing levels have led to longer response times, officers getting to the highest priority calls. It takes longer to get there, as well as longer wait times for the lower priority calls that have to wait while officers are handling the higher priority calls. We've seen those times increase kind of year over year, and Dr. Kringen will go into that a little bit here in a little bit. Next slide, please. So how the partnership works. The partnership is designed to be a valuable and innovative measure to increase public safety. I pretty much talk with the regional director for Central Texas for DPS. It is Director Vincent Luciano on a daily basis. He and I are talking about the things that we can do to make the partnership stronger. If there are things that arise that give either of us concern, we address them head on and very quickly. And as briefings are held every single weekend, myself and other members of my staff are there with the DPS troopers, kind of talking about Austin. Many of them have never worked in Austin before. So we want to make sure that they understand, you know, what does our community feel like? What is the culture of Austin? What can they expect as they conduct this operation within the city? And importantly, what are my expectations as a chief of police on how this community expects to be policed? So it's important to understand that each one of the departments maintains their own operational jurisdiction. Of course, the Texas DPS has jurisdiction statewide. It is not new for them to be in the city of Austin. They've been here. Many of the people that I go to these briefings with, I've known for years because they work in the city of Austin and they understand the city of Austin. But of course, they operate under their own set of policies and procedures. We operate under the same state law, and we're also commissioned by the same commissioning body, the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, which requires the same amount of training for both Austin PD officers and Texas DPS officers. I know many questions have risen about what is the difference between the training that the two departments receive, and the fact is that they have to meet the same standards. So my experience with Texas DPS is an incredibly professional and respected organization that is here to help us right now as we're going through the tough times that we are. Next slide. The partnership really has a twofold objective. The first is to assist us with our traffic enforcement. As part of the traffic enforcement, having a lot of officers out there, they're making backups of APD officers on high priority calls, and when necessary, will be the first unit on scene for priority call response. They are targeting aggressive driving, reckless driving, racing, as was mentioned just a little bit ago, and then other hazardous traffic violations. The second part of the objective is reducing violence, and particularly gun-related violence. These can include shootings, assaults, robberies, other major crimes that happen, unfortunately, on a daily basis here in Austin, and have been working on that for almost the last 3 weeks and have been incredibly effective. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. As I turn it over in a moment to Dr. Kringen, he's going to be talking certainly about numbers, about the number of crimes that have happened in different parts of the city, and how those are changing based on this operation. But I think we cannot lose sight of the fact that behind every single one of those numbers is a person who has been affected by some type of crime that has happened in this city, a person or a family that is grieving potentially, or hurting because somebody in their family was hurt. And I, as the chief of police, and I know every one of my officers takes that incredibly seriously. That is the reason that we put the uniform on every single day. It is my responsibility to make sure that we maintain the safety in this city. And so I want to make sure that it is done in the right way, but at the same time, we cannot lose sight of the fact that we need to be people-centered, that we need to keep people at the center of this effort and make sure that we're doing it the right way, and not causing harm, but actually helping. All right, next slide. I mentioned the collaboration. What I've heard over and over and over from Director Luciano, as well as other members of leadership with DPS, DPS is here to help. They're not here to take over. They're not here, certainly not here to cause harm or to cause anxiety. That is not their mission. Their mission is to help. And that is clearly communicated at the outset of every new squad that comes in to work in the city, to make sure that that is the mindset that we're here to keep citizens safe, to always have that smile on your face, to, when possible, write a warning. You don't have to write a ticket. And that has been happening. Texas DPS, I mentioned this, operates obviously under state law, but its own set of policies, just like APD does. They are not following APD policy. However, their policies and our policies many, many times align. Director Luciano talks every week with DA Jose Garza and County Attorney Delia Garza about how things are going. And it is their normal practice, whatever jurisdiction that they go into, to contact the local prosecutors and see how things operate in that jurisdiction so that they can align their enforcement actions with those prosecutorial practices. And that's what they're doing here. So you will see them many times doing a cite and release based on the cite and release policies of both offices. And that is kind of the same thing that APD is doing. So, so again, just because DPS doesn't follow our policy doesn't mean that many times those policies aren't very, very similar. It is our intent to continue to report weekly and push the numbers out, to push data out. And we will be doing that on a regular basis, again, weekly, including the number of arrests and traffic stops that are made, as well as other information. Next slide, please. On mental health calls, Texas DPS also trains their troopers in mental health response and crisis intervention. But to the largest degree that we are able, we're trying to get APD officers on the scene of our mental health calls. As a matter of fact, we're trying to get them on the scene of every single dispatch call. If a call comes in, 911 call comes into the call taking center and it generates a call for service, I want APD officers at that scene handling that scene as opposed to DPS. That doesn't necessarily mean that DPS won't respond to it or even get there first. But what I brief out, and I know that DPS is doing the same with its troopers, is please get to the scene, stabilize the scene. If violence is occurring, stop the violence, and then hold everything in place until APD can arrive. And that is why you will see that the number of, for instance, mental health interventions that they've actually done are relatively small. It's because we are responding to those scenes and we are handling those. I want us to be handling the major investigations. I'll talk about that here in just a moment, but again, whether it's a mental health call or another major investigation, I want APD to be handling it. The troopers at the outset of the week are provided an Austin resource guide to assist them on calls. So in that guide, it has things related to Sobering Center, the Arch, Caritas of Austin, LifeWorks for the youth, veteran resources, and other important community partners. We want them to have that information so that they can make the same type of referrals that we make on a regular basis. And then, as I said, calls for service that involve major investigations, domestic violence. We're handling all traffic fatalities, sexual assaults, homicides, aggravated robberies. Those type of investigations continue to be handled by APD. That doesn't mean there might not be some collaboration with DPS, and they bring their criminal investigative division, CID, into help sometimes with those investigations, but ultimately we want APD to be handling and presenting those cases for prosecution. All right, next slide, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kringen at this point to talk about some of the data.
Thank you. So basically, in beginning the partnership with DPS, we're providing a great deal of data about what's happening in Austin. We recognize that while some of the troopers have a background here, some of them will not, and for them to manage their operational efforts, we want to make sure they understand to the greatest extent possible what is happening in the city of Austin. And so we're focusing primarily on two areas. One is traffic safety, and the other is violent crime, in particular, violent crime involving firearms. So I'm going to start by talking about traffic safety. DPS is patrolling major roadways, and this is based on analysis that's been done by APD as well as in conjunction with Austin Traffic. So we coordinate with Austin Traffic on a weekly basis to provide an update to DPS about where traffic collisions are occurring. We're most interested in those that result in an injury, so they're higher speed collisions and whatnot. Additionally, Austin Traffic provides us some information on the sort of rate of travel as measured in places, the number of cars that are exceeding the speed limit excessively as opposed to being at or minorly above the speed limit. So the fundamental areas we're looking at, it's Highway 183, it's MOPAC, and it's I-35, right? These are the areas that we have asked DPS to focus traffic enforcement on with the specific goal of reducing collisions, in particular injury collisions and those that might result in a fatality. This is an area that I think we're all aware has been understaffed in APD as we've made operational changes about what we can do on patrol. Our ability to proactively patrol traffic has gone down. We've had various adjustments to the units that are involved. And so this is an area that's been understaffed, and DPS taking up that for us has had some initial results that are promising. Basically, as far as their activities go, in the first 2 weeks, they conducted 4,016 traffic stops. Most of these traffic stops are focused on intervention, right? So in most of the stops, they're issuing a verbal warning, right? So approximately 75% of the time, it's a stop. There is some legal reason for the stop. There is someone who's speeding, someone who's running a stoplight, these types of things. The stop is made, a verbal warning is given, and the person moves on the way, right? Tickets are issued in about 25%, so about 1 out of 4 of those cases. And so basically related to the traffic stops, there have been a lot of questions about that. APD and DPS are held to the same standards related to the collection and reporting of demographic data on traffic stops. So the demographic data about the traffic stops conducted by by DPS in the city of Austin will be publicly available, right? And we'll provide it as soon as it's made available. Next slide, please. So violent crime is the area we've talked about a little bit more. Basically, the brief that we've given out to DPS in request for assistance has helped them understand where the highest area of number of calls for assistance occur. These are calls from the community to the 911 call center for violent events, and in particular with an emphasis on those that involve a firearm. DPS officers are patrolling those areas to do a number of things. One is to provide some deterrent effect. 2 is to be able to respond more quickly, as Chief Chacon pointed out, to be able to stabilize a violent situation while we wait for APD to arrive to ultimately handle the situation, right? And so they're also responding to elements that they might see if it occurred in front of them. At the same time, those type of things would likely, in most cases, be referred to APD when we arrive on scene. So DPS is partnering with the Violent Crimes Investigative Unit, right? We're really particularly interested in homicide and aggravated assault. As well, we pay a lot of attention to what's happening with robbery because there's a great deal of crossover between robbery and aggravated assault. I can come back to that in just a moment. As we've stated, in all these cases, what we're really looking at is the gun violence, right? What we're most concerned about is how do we reduce gun violence, how do we resolve active cases, and how do we proactively target crime in areas that are experiencing high levels of violent crime. Next slide. All right, so the initial results are promising, and I want to present this with a little bit of an explanation because I believe there's been some confusion about what was discussed in the last press conference and in the memo. There are fundamentally 2 separate questions. One is, did it go down, right? The second question is, did that reduction happen as a matter of chance, or is it likely related to the DPS deployment? There's been confusion because the techniques for answering either question are slightly different. A lot of questions have focused on what happened last year in the same week. And I can state In the first week of the DPS deployment this year, there were 67 violent crimes in Austin. In the same week the previous year, there were exactly 89 violent crimes. That is the 25% reduction that has been discussed. The separate discussion about comparing to averages is a statistical technique that allows us to say at a level of scientific certainty, we would not expect to see a 25% reduction happen randomly, on its own, or by chance. The initial evidence suggests that that reduction is an effect of the DPS deployment. Moving into the second week, we see some other numbers that are likewise informative. There's a 31% decrease going from the second week of April in 2022 to the second week of April in 2023. Last year, in the second week of DPS's deployment, we had 124 violent events. Last week, we had 68. That's a 31% decrease. Again, the statistical testing that follows that suggests those reductions are not random. They're not an artifact of anything else. They occur exactly at the point that DPS begins their patrol efforts. So statistically, the initial evidence suggests DPS's patrol is reducing violent crime in the city. Now, the areas that they're specifically working, you see these effects being remarkably stronger. In the actual areas that DPS is working, where we have the highest volume of calls for service for violent crime, there's been a 58% decrease in the first week, a 49% decrease compared to the previous year in the second week. Those are remarkable sized effects. The follow-up on that is that this is reducing the number of calls for service coming into the department. Those reductions of 58% and 49% are occurring in specific areas where we have a high call volume load. Throughout the city, the availability of APD officers as a result of those decreases has resulted in substantially improved service, which likewise relates to a decrease in overall calls for service. So we see a 15% decrease in violent crime calls for service in the first week and a 12% decrease in the second week, suggesting that that effect is at this point holding. Now, more importantly, what we want to look at is how are we servicing the community when we actually get that call for service? So if we go to the next slide, this is where we actually see the results in terms of APD operational ability to support playing out. Emergency assistance calls in the deployment areas. So these are the most dangerous, most risky, violent calls for service involving firearms. They decreased by nearly 2 minutes in the first week of the deployment. That held relatively strongly at 1 minute and 33-second reduction in the second week as compared to the previous period. Those differences are remarkably large given the actual process required to receive a phone call, find an available resource in an officer, and get them to the scene of the crime. But urgent calls for assistance, and I want to make sure everyone understands the difference. These are all violent calls for service. The fundamental difference, essentially, between an emergency call and an urgent call is an emergency call is happening at the time the call is made. An urgent call has just ended the activity. So if a person standing by calls in a robbery in a convenience store, that is an emergency call because it is currently happening. If the shopkeeper makes the phone call the moment the person leaves, that's an urgent call for service. Urgent calls for service are still exceedingly risky because the suspects tend to be in the area. If they're armed with firearms, we track many occurrences where other events happen very close in time, very close in space with the same individuals. Those calls for service, the urgent calls for service, we reduced response time by over 7 minutes in the first week. 5 minutes and 26 seconds in the second week. So we're seeing remarkable reductions in those call for service times. And so as we explained in the memo, those call for service times were on the order, and there's been confusion about this. They were averaging 19 and a half minutes. They're now down to 12 and a half minutes. There's been concern that perhaps that was a single call for service. That's the actual average in those areas prior to the DPS deployment. So we're getting them down remarkably, something on the order of about a third in reduction, right? And this is actually playing out through the whole city. A lot of the analysis that we've done suggests there's a high level of interdependence. When we have difficult response periods in one area of the city, it draws resources from the entire city, and service everywhere suffers. So we do see that urgent calls for service were decreased by almost a minute in week one in the entire city, right? And almost a minute again in the second week in the entire city. The emergency calls decreased by 23 seconds in the first week and about 15 seconds in the second week. So we see the effect of faster response to these violent events in these high call areas playing out throughout the entire operation throughout the city. And these results are very promising. So in summary, we've seen a reduction in violent crime. We have seen a reduction in the number of calls for service for assistance related to violent crime. And we see that we're arriving more quickly to respond when a violent crime occurs. And next slide.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kringen, and that concludes our presentation and kind of our prepared remarks, but glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Sure thing. Councilmember Velasquez.
Thank y'all for being here. I'm not sure how everybody else is receiving calls. The second this partnership came online, I was inundated with phone calls from community members, texts that wanted to understand the partnership better. I also love driving across this city and can tell you that there is a disparity between what is happening west of 35 and east of 35 as far as presence is concerned. So I had a few questions to that. How many troopers are now dispatched as part of this partnership?
So the actual number of troopers will vary week to week, and that is a DPS decision. We don't tell them how many to send every single week. I can say that it's generally a sizable presence of troopers, and then they split them between those two objectives that I talked about. Some of them are doing traffic, and some are doing the violent crime, but there is no set number per week.
So if we said last week, do we know how many were here last week?
I don't know the number. No,
Okay.
sir.
Would you be able to get that for us, Chief?
I can find out and ask them whether they're, if they can share that information.
Thank you. How are we ensuring that there is equitable distribution of troopers across the city and not just a heavy presence along the Eastern Crescent? And you and I discussed this, and I discussed this with our city manager. I've driven from both parts of the city, and you can tell that there is a very heavy police presence in District 3, especially the Riverside area, Montopolis, and Old Torf areas.
So I'm going to let Dr. Kringen first talk about how the deployment is determined, and then I'll kind of close those remarks out.
Yeah, so definitely understand the concern. I want to make sure everyone understands that the information we provide DPS to make their deployment decisions focuses fundamentally around those calls for service. It's not a decision by the Austin Police Department to say, here is where we want you to patrol. It is basically reporting on what the community is asking via 911 related to violent crime. Now, I can say, as far as the distribution goes, from my analysis of it, I do know that DPS has worked at least 7 of the 9 sectors in the city. And so one of the reasons that this might be difficult to understand is that DPS is moving its patrols as the effects have played out. So I pointed out in one of the previous slides the substantial reduction in violent crime calls for service in the areas they worked in the first week, which means the areas they work in the second week are different. The areas they work in the third week will be different, and we can already say, based upon what we have seen, the initial areas where the highest volume of calls for service are no longer the highest volume of calls for service. So as we provide updated information to DPS, they shift their patrols, right? And we have already seen reductions in certain areas that will likely move them to different areas. I expect within a short period of time, DPS will have worked every sector in the city, depending upon as we move resources or as they move resources, depending upon whether we see crime level or calls for service come back up in that area, they may return. But ultimately, our goal is to assist them in moving as efficiently as possible through the city to reduce violent calls for service everywhere in the city.
I'm sorry, I just kind of wanted to reiterate that this is call driven. The decision on exactly where to deploy is not based upon we're telling them to deploy to this sector or this sector. What we're telling them is this is where the calls for service are coming in. And as Dr. Kringen was just saying, we have seen the mapping of this is beginning to change. And so I can tell you this week is different than last week. Next week will be different than this week. And you will see over time where you feel that presence right now, probably within the next couple of weeks, will certainly dissipate. And those troopers are moving, as he said. We've already worked 7 of the 9 sectors and anticipate that before this is done, we will have worked pretty much the whole city.
Thank you. Is information related to immigration status being collected at these traffic stops?
So I specifically asked DPS that question, and the answer was no. The only time that immigration status is asked is if a custodial arrest is made for a criminal offense, and then that question gets asked at the jail. And whether it's APD or DPS, that question is asked.
Can we get further information on how many undocumented individuals have been stopped or cited?
We don't have that information because we're not collecting the information on how many are documented or undocumented.
And you're saying just at the jail?
Just at the jail, that's correct.
Okay. How many of our DPS stops for low-level violations have led to arrests that have placed people in immigration detention centers or under an immigration detention?
I don't know that information. The actual breakdown of arrests, that's DPS data. What they're providing us is higher level data right now that we're pushing out. For instance, whether it's a felony offense that they arrested for, whether it's a misdemeanor offense that they've arrested for, but I don't know the exact categories or the offenses that they're arresting for. And then once they get to the jail and whether they are, whatever happens there with regard to if they go to a detention center or not is outside, I think, the control of both APD and DPS and has more to do with jail procedures.
Okay, and just to follow up on one of the last questions, you said that people are being dispatched because of calls about reckless driving and whatnot. So at the outset, we were having heavier calls from, let's say, Charlie sector or District 3, and that's where people were being dispatched. It's all contingent on where the phone calls or the calls are coming from.
Calls for service, and it isn't. I would say that as we're looking at it, it is not contained to one single sector. You will have, as we're looking at it, probably I should let Dr. Kringen explain this a little bit more, but you will see crossover between sectors, and that we have heavy call loads. But if you want to address that a little bit.
Yeah, really quickly. And I just want to make sure for clarification, because to eliminate any confusion, when we say dispatch, what we specifically mean is when a dispatcher from 911 orders an APD vehicle to head to a location. I just want to clarify, when you're saying dispatch, you mean where generally are DPS choosing to work, right? And so, as we said, we provided them initial information, which looked at what sort of happened in the previous year related to calls for service. We specifically did not focus on arrests or crimes known to police. We focused on what we think of as sort of customer demand, right? For those issues that we think are most important, that we want to have the most immediate safety gain on. But those things are changing, and I can say, and hopefully we'll have enough information soon to be able to provide some indicators on it. These locations have changed drastically in the first 2 weeks, and if we think about it and we say, this area has the highest demand, and we've just said we have a 58% reduction there. I can say in the latest analysis, there are areas of Austin that traditionally we would not have predicted as having the highest area of number of calls for service for violent crime, and DPS will now be working those areas. So in the end, the initial deployment was fundamentally DPS's decision based upon our information about what happened over the last year, right? As they're affecting it, we're providing them updated information, and they're moving. As long as they continue to be effective, they're going to move through every area of the city. And
and just to make sure that I understand it, the initial response was data from last year. Where they're moving now is going to be data from this year or calls that are coming in.
Yeah, that's correct. So what we looked at to give them initial data was fundamentally what happened for 365 days prior to the day they deployed. So it's recent in that it really is what happened yesterday, right, as of the date of the initial deployment. But to track a historic pattern, it goes back over the course of a year.
And with that, you said you were surprised that there were certain areas. Are you able to share what areas those were that you were surprised about?
I need some more data to be able to say it with the sort of level of scientific confidence, but I will say the sort of initial exploratory on it is that the effects in the high call volume areas have been substantial beyond what I would have predicted. As a result of that, the violent crime happening in other areas can now become more of a priority.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ryan Alter.
Thank you very much. And I just, at the outset, both to the manager and the chief, I just want to make sure, one of our jobs here is oversee and represent our constituents. And tough questions doesn't mean, we're criticizing you or think you're doing something wrong. It's just part of our job. So I want to lay that out before I have a couple questions for you. And really, it's on slide 10, you talk about that decrease week 1 compared to first week of April the year before, week 2 compared to second week of April the year before. And what I'm trying to get a good sense of is, what about week 0 or the last week of March, right? How does that compare this year to last year? Did we already see some kind of reduction, or was it just
Yeah, if I understand the question, and this is a really valid question, and it's why we do what we'd call a significance test based upon a ton of data rather than just what happened 1 week last year, right? We can all understand that. I've said it a few times, it's caused confusion. This week this year compared to this week last year is informative, but it is not definitional, right? You can think of any example in Austin where we had an awkward week, any issues that we had in the city that might have affected people's behavior. And if we're looking at that week compared to this year, it's going to be different. So we do both. In fact, what we do is we look at the rate of change from week to week. We look at the rate of change from the 4-week average prior to the next week. We look at the 168-day average, which is the 6-month average the next week, and we look at the year-long average related to it. We also do the direct comparisons to the individual weeks, which is to last week, to 4 weeks ago, right, to 6 months ago, and to 1 year ago. Now, the modeling is reasonably sophisticated, right? When I say we look at averages, what we're really looking at is a long-term average, as well as a moving average that happens seasonally, as well as an order of integration, is crime fundamentally going up or down at all, as well as something we call autoregression, which is how well can we predict today given yesterday, and how well can we predict today given the same day a year ago. And so in all of the cases of the descriptive comparatives, it's gone down. Right? So the ones that are most meaningful to report, it's been made clear that the preference of the public in general is to look at sort of this week versus last week as the most basic summary number, right? The one that is most relevant to me in trying to understand whether this is achieving anything is actually the statistical test.
right? And so if you did that same statistical test for the last week in March before this occurred, would you have had a statistically significant decrease from the year prior? Not to say that we might have a greater decrease now, but did we already see that decrease happening?
Right. So there are two things to be aware of. One is there's a confound involved, which is to say we began our analysis with the first full week of DPS deployment. We did have DPS troopers arrive in the city the week prior, a smaller group is my understanding, and only for a limited number of days. There is a reduction from the week prior to that transitional week. It's not significant. It is within the range of what we would predict given the basic seasonal patterns of March moving into April, right? So I hope that answers the question.
Kind of. It sounds to me like the answer is you haven't done the analysis, but if you had taken a week when there were no DPS officers, whatever week that is, first week of March, second week of March, third week of March, and you perform this exact same statistical analysis, what would the result be? Would the result be that even in a week in March before we had DPS that we had statistically significant less crime? Or would it be that our crime pattern has been pretty static and now we've seen a statistical change?
So we have done the test for the week prior to any DPS involvement to both the week of partial deployment and the week of full deployment. And in both cases, you see a significant reduction in the amount of crime, looking at the comparisons.
Okay. And then on slide 11, where you talk about the reduction in response times, is that the comparison year over year, like we had on slide 10, compared to that same week the year prior?
Yeah, so we look at year-over-year comparison, but in our statistical test, which is more meaningful, we're actually looking at what has been happening with call for service times. So in this case, the statistical test, it's more important to understand what recent call for service times have been. So while we look at what happened a year ago, the internal metrics that we use to think about it have a lot more to do with what's happened over the last 4 weeks. So that's why in all of these cases, we do the previous week, the previous 2 weeks, the previous 4 weeks, the 168-day mark, and 365-day mark.
So that 7-minute reduction, that's over to your 4 weeks or to your previous year?
So the 7-minute reduction in, 1 second, let me make sure I pull the slide. So the 7-minute reduction was related to a 19-minute and 30-second average response time for that area. That average response time was, if I recall correctly, because I don't have my analytics slide up. Oh wait, I have it on my phone. So we reported a 7-minute reduction in urgent calls for service, only in the areas that were worked. So the 7-minute reduction is consistent with a reduction from 52 weeks prior, right? So the year long. It is about a 3.5-minute reduction from the week before DPS deployment, right?
And are those like your priority 1s, 2s?
Yeah, those are priority 1s. So those are emergency, meaning it was violent, but the incident has just ended. Right?
And building off of Councilmember Velasquez's questions, when we talk about the calls, I had the privilege to go on a ride out a couple weeks ago, and sit there, you look at the screen, and there's your 1s, your 2s. Is DPS logged in the exact same system, so they're seeing the exact same thing our officers are seeing?
They are not. They're not logged into the same system. We're working on the technology to at least be able to let both sides see where the other units are. And I'm working with Director Luciano on that right now. They're not in our system, but they are on our radio, so they can hear the calls as they're being dispatched.
And that's how they're figuring out where to go, and they'll just respond that I'm responding to.
Correct.
Okay. That's all I have for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we can all agree that a reduction in violent crime is a win for our city. Whether you live in downtown like myself, or you live in Hyde Park, or you live in another district, we can count those as successes. But I think it's also worth pointing out that Austin is a very safe city. Right here from the DPS. And when you compare violent crime in Austin, it is less than violent crime in Arlington, Fort Worth, Corpus Christi, Lubbock, San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, Killeen, Amarillo. We are an incredibly safe city. I think that says a lot about the leadership that you and your department have shown, Chief Chacon. But I think it's always very important to get context and to ask these hopefully not too tough questions. And I'm thankful that y'all are here today. But my first question, could you provide information out of the data provided on page 3 of the staff memo of how many arrests were made due to violent crime? It says on page 3 of 3, to date, the joint operation has resulted in 96 felony arrests and 63 misdemeanor arrests. So my first question of that is how many were violent crime? And then also how many of those arrests were drug related?
Again, that's the high-level information that DPS has provided to us.
Mm-hmm.
What I can do is request at the same time as I'm making these other requests, regarding how many people were deployed and so forth, whether they can break those down a little bit, at least in some general categories around drug-related arrests, violent arrests, and then maybe nonviolent, for instance, warrants and things like that they'll come across.
Got it. And then my next question is, it's been stated the average number of violent crimes in a week for 2022 was 89 per week. What was the overall trend for violent crime for 2022? And if y'all could provide information, as well as broken down by murder and non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, aggravated assault.
Yeah, we can absolutely provide that, and given that it's a reasonable amount of data, we can put it together for you. We have it reported in a number of places. I do want to clarify one element that has created a great deal of confusion, and I will add to that a cautionary note. Everyone should be very cautious in reading, whether it comes from DPS or otherwise, any of the reports about the comparative level of violence in cities. In fact, FBI, that is the national depository for all this information, specifically indicates that those comparisons should not be made. There are various reasons for it. One reason I can tell you very quickly off the list that you shared is that the agencies on that list actually report under different federal standards, which means the way things are counted is very different. So, for what it's worth, I'm not asserting that the net conclusion is wrong. I would just say use those numbers with caution. The other element of that reporting that reporting change that FBI put into place, beginning with agencies in about 2016, is that the way in which crime is counted, because Austin has adopted the new standard, is actually different than most jurisdictions in the U.S. It causes a great deal of confusion because we produce a document called the Chief's Monthly Report, which includes an FBI NIBRS category of crimes against persons. That category of crimes has shown a marginal reduction over the last 6 months. That is not violent crime. The next category, crimes against property, includes robbery. FBI has decided to classify robbery as a crime against property because the goal of the crime is to obtain property, but the nature of the crime is inherently violent. It is the coercion of property by force. So we have a lot of confusion about the counts on violent crime because we include for operational purposes robbery as a violent crime. So the documentation varies substantially. So we'll provide that. We'll include the robbery. Generally, the categories that we're most interested in would include robbery, aggravated assault, sexual assault, and murder. Those are the categories that make up our composite of violent crime, because that composite is different than either the NIBRS standard or the UCR standard that most agencies are still on. It does make the comparison problematic.
Got it. Well, thank you. A few more questions. Just want to know how many violent crimes, and you might have answered this already, occurred the week before the partnership. I believe because the data that's been collected is 2 weeks worth. Because what we had already seen, at least the first 2 months of this year, was comparatively January of 2023. If you compared it to Jan of 2022, and likewise February of 2023 versus February of 2022, violent crime had gone down by 8% in January previous year and 5% in February. So it seems like there was already a trend of a decrease in violent crime. But I'm just curious how many violent crimes occurred 2 weeks before the partnership.
Yeah, I'll get you the counts on that so that you can look at it. I will say those numbers are the NIBRS reductions in crimes against persons. Those do not include robberies, which are actually up. So there is a marginal net reduction of about 1%, if I recall correctly, on our index of violent crime. It's also important to recognize, and this is something that gets lost in the minor discussion, is that in 2020, the number of violent crimes and violent crime calls for service in Austin went up precipitously. It has not come back down. So we spend a lot of time discussing the 5% reduction or the 2% increase without looking at the 35% increase that occurred in that year that has held. So it's important to keep in mind that the longer trend, and this is an example of where it's important to think about the different periods of comparison. The other part that is not reported in there that we're happy to provide information on is more concerning to me than the increase in the number of crimes is the proportion of those crimes that involve a firearm. That proportion went up precipitously in 2020 and has not come down either. So this again becomes another way in which comparing violent crime statistics is challenging, in that a call for service for aggravated assault can mean a great number of different things. You may have a jurisdiction that has more aggravated assaults, yet fewer aggravated assaults with firearms. And so those are the numbers that we really need to discuss as a city.
Got it. And I mean, a lot of my other questions might have the same answer, but do you have any timeline of when we would be able to get any of that data?
Yeah, we can start pulling it together for you, so it should be reasonably quick.
Okay, great. So a few more questions, then I'll be done. You know, one of the big things that y'all talked about in your slide deck was traffic-related deaths. Is there any data on the reduction of traffic-related deaths since this partnership has come to be?
So a fatality in a traffic collision is fortunately a relatively rare event. Predominantly for analytic purposes, what we look at are CR3s or collisions that involve an injury. So it would be a reasonably long period of time before we could make a statement about that would be scientifically supported about whether it's affected traffic fatalities. We should have enough data in the next probably 2 to 3 weeks to be able to discuss whether it has reduced the number of injury collisions or perhaps the number of actual collisions.
And just to follow up on that, we work with Austin Transportation and the Vision Zero project to kind of track those numbers as well. So that's an interdepartmental kind of effort. And, you know, even the deployment strategy that we had on the traffic side has been driven in part by Austin Transportation. So we're working with them as well on this piece.
Great, thank you. And then my last two questions are kind of off of questions that Councilmember Velasquez had asked. But would you guys be able to also provide information on arrests by districts that include demographics? So the 10 council districts, and then break it down into, you know, demographics of age, race, gender, et cetera.
So I've requested the demographic data and don't have a solid answer on how quickly they're going to be able to provide that. When what they're providing me right now is pretty high level, you know, with the number of stops that are being made, for instance, which we know are significant. Breaking down that data and however it is that they're collecting it, I would imagine it would take as much time for me to be able to do it. But you know, we're certainly willing to provide that data once it's provided to us. Where exactly the stops are happening, certainly they don't know, our council districts. They would have to provide that data to us somehow. I'll have to ask whether that can be done. And how heavy a lift it would be and whether they're willing to do it.
Yeah. I mean, just anecdotally, and I think Councilmember Velasquez had mentioned, but I certainly got a lot of calls. But, you know, things that happen on the east side often differ from a lot of other neighborhoods and districts, right? You know, how one is treated or how one's neighborhood is patrolled or lack thereof, it differs. So I would just be curious to see if possible, if we could get like district by district information. And then my last question before I stop talking is: would you guys also be able to get a breakdown on the stated probable cause that is used for DPS traffic stops or traffic stops in general?
You know, at some point when it makes sense to do it, because right now I think that a lot of the questions that are coming at us are really directed towards APD. Having DPS come to the briefing, and Director Luciano has offered recently to come to the briefing and perhaps answer some of the questions, because some of the questions that you have I don't know the answer to because it's not our agency.
Yeah.
So I think that you know, at some point in the future it's going to make sense for them to come and answer your questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Councilmember Harper Madison has her hand up. I'm sorry, Councilmember Cadre, were you done? Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. Councilmember Harper Madison, you have the floor. I think you're on mute, though. There you go.
Right now,
There you are.
I would just like to weigh in and
Please.
just
Yep,
say
yep.
very much that I appreciate our new council members asking such vibrant questions and look forward to the answers. So I think maybe our public safety committee is a good spot for this information to be presented thoroughly.
I'll step in here for the mayor. Did you want to?
Well, no, go ahead.
Oh, I would just say I'm sure that is acceptable. I think there was already some conversation around other topics we were discussing today coming to public safety. So I will defer to, there's two vice chairs in the room that probably could corroborate taking this up and getting another deep dive. I know it's a conversation that a lot of people in town are just either curious to know how it's going, how the partnership works. I've got some questions as well. Do you have questions today, Councilmember Harper Madison, that you wanted to continue with?
I think my colleagues have already stated my positions. In which case, yeah, I just look forward to those answers.
Appreciate that. Let's go with Councilmember Kelly and then Fuentes.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem. Sorry, my mind just went blank. I was going to say. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. And thank you, Chief and Dr. Kringen for being here today answering our questions. I appreciate that you addressed a lot of the questions that I put in my memo in the press conference, the memo I sent to the interim city manager. So I appreciate that also. You've been talking a lot about the different districts here in Austin and how the response has been. Have you collaborated with Williamson County at all on this initiative? And the reason I ask is because Williamson County is also in my district. And I know the Williamson County Sheriff's Office handed me a report, which I gave to our interim assistant city manager, Bruce Mills, where in the last, I think it's since October of 2022, October 1st of 2022 through March 21st of 2023, they have responded to over 8,200 calls in my district. And so I was wondering if any of your data collaborated with them on that.
It has not, council member. I haven't reached out to the sheriff there to discuss this. I guess it is not, that's a surprisingly high number of calls, but it shouldn't be because as Dr. Kringen was talking about, when we have these resource intensive calls that happen in the areas that we're talking about, it draws down on other parts of the city, which will draw us from certain parts that ultimately either Travis County, Williamson County, or Hayes County may have to respond to because there's no available APD officers that are there at that moment. I've tried to be a good partner with our local law enforcement. I've certainly had many conversations with Sheriff Hernandez, but have not reached out to Sheriff Gleason. So yeah, that's a great idea.
I did reach out to Sheriff Gleason in order to get this information, and I actually want to correct my number. It is 8,528 calls, and they are everything from suicidal people to livestock to abuse. I mean, I'd be more than happy to provide you with this list, Chief, if you'd like it.
Thank you, Councilmember.
District 6 is one of the furthest districts away from the center of the city. We are one of the furthest from, the closest substation is Lamplight Village. And I know that a lot of calls happen in our district, and so the need for law enforcement is high. I just want to make sure that when we are looking at that data, that we are ensuring that we are collecting all of the available data that we have so that we can get a more complete picture, and that when our resources are distributed, they're distributed equitably. So thank you very much for taking that into consideration. What feedback from officers at APD have you heard in regards to this collaboration?
The feedback has been pretty tremendous on both sides, quite honestly. I've talked to DPS troopers, I've talked to the APD officers, and it was put, the best way that I can put it is one of the members of DPS leadership who's out here on a nightly basis along with our folks said that it feels almost seamless, that it is almost like it's one agency that's working because of the collaboration is working so well. DPS troopers are backing us up. We're backing them up. We're handling all of the dispatch calls as well as taking possession of all firearms that are recovered in the city, and those will be handled per city policy and APD policy on the disposal ultimately of firearms. And so it has been very, very good, very well received, and quite honestly, much needed.
Thank you. You spoke earlier about sometimes how DPS and APD policies align. Could you give me examples or give the council examples of when that has occurred since the collaboration began?
The one that certainly jumps to mind is on the issue of marijuana enforcement. APD generally is not taking much action on low-level marijuana, and there's a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is council direction. Normally for for DPS, that's a custody arrest. But working with the local prosecutors, they are citing on those and releasing, and then those citations go over to the Justice of the Peace Court generally, or they may go to the county courts depending. But that's certainly an example that I can give of where those policies are aligning.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I have one last question, and that is, have you heard directly from any community members regarding DPS's conduct while conducting patrols, and what has that been like?
The feedback that I'm getting has been very positive. One story that was recently told to me was DPS troopers in uniform walking into an H-E-B, receiving a round of applause from the people that are just there, the citizens, and certainly gratitude to the governor, to Colonel McCraw, head of DPS, and to all the DPS troopers that are here to just help. I think that people understand that, and they hold themselves accountable the same way that we do. So I think that it is, it's just been a good partnership.
Thank you for saying that. I ran into some DPS officers off of Mopac who were having dinner one evening, and I actually bought their dinner without letting them know. You can do that. That's the thing. You can just tell the wait person. But as a token of gratitude, I thought it was really important to walk over there and just say thank you, and then to do that behind the scenes. So we definitely appreciate, I definitely appreciate the assistance that we're getting from DPS, and I am more appreciative of the transparency that we are having today regarding the questions that the community as well as these council members have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Fuentes.
Thank you. Dr. Kringen, you mentioned a couple of times how you understand how the data presented in the memo was confusing to some. And I want to underscore the reason why it's confusing is because council received a memo on Thursday, and then there was a press conference the next day touting these numbers without any other additional information. The questions that we're asking here for demographics, for specifics on the types of citations, for the specifics on where the traffic stops are happening, which we still have not received access to, that is what helps make this a confusing situation. Because ultimately, we as council members have to go back to our community and explain, where are these troopers patrolling? Why are they patrolling in our particular neighborhoods? And, is there a disproportionate impact in our community? Those are the questions we have to be responsible for, and we are held accountable to the safety of our communities by the voters. So I just wanted to underscore that point there. So just to get back, so I want to make it really, really clear here, the questions that we've asked around the demographics of who's being pulled over, who's being, receiving citations, arrested, and where this patrolling is happening is specific because we are talking about, what makes Austin a safe city. And part of us being able to talk about the safety of our community is being able to talk about, no, there's not, racial profiling happening, and here's why. But unless we have that information, then I can't make that case to my community. So us receiving just half of the picture here really puts us in a challenging position. And I'm really pleased to hear that DPS is being collaborative, because I hope in that spirit of collaboration that they're able to come before us and share that information, because those are the questions that I've been receiving. And so to be really clear on our requests for more specifics on the data, when can we expect that information to become available?
I've passed that request along to Director Luciano. We've spoken about it a couple of times already, and not only has he committed that they are going to provide the data, although he's working with his kind of bosses there at DPS on how quickly that can be done, as well as his own data analysis unit on how quickly it can be extracted, but has also made a commitment to come in front of mayor and council if y'all want him to directly answer questions, so it isn't just coming through me. So the short answer is I don't know how long it's going to take them to be able to collect that information, but that they have made a commitment to provide it.
Thank you. And I certainly would like to to invite him to come before us and to have that conversation. And as part of that, the other topic I wanted to talk about is accountability. If there is an incident to occur involving a DPS trooper and one of our constituents, where is the accountability mechanism? What happens in that situation?
So, I think that's a really great question because, something maybe that needs to be explained really well to the public. If they have interaction with an Austin police officer and want to offer either a compliment or a complaint, then we know that the mechanism is the Office of Police Oversight. With DPS, who has distinctive uniforms from ours, they're a different color, they have different patches and different badges and all those things. If they have a complaint, then they're going to need to go through their process. They can't go to the OPO to file those complaints because the OPO doesn't have any jurisdiction over them. So being able to, and we'll certainly, if that is the case, be able to help push them in whatever direction we need to make sure that the complaint goes to the right place. To my knowledge, I think there's been one complaint that's come into the OPO related to a DPS trooper that we have referred over to DPS to make sure that happens. That's not the preferred way of doing it. It's going to cause a delay, and really, it's not the OPO's responsibility to do that. So I don't encourage that, but we want to be helpful. We want to be responsive, and DPS has its own way of processing complaints.
And we'll be able to provide that information to the public.
I will ask Director Luciano to be able to speak to that. Yes, ma'am.
And as part of, and that's, a lot of the questions that have come up are just like, what is this partnership? For how long are we going to have this partnership? What we've been sharing back with the community is the staffing shortage, which we know DPS also has a staffing shortage. I think they're down 500 troopers. So Chief Chacon, can you share with us what we're doing to address our staffing shortage and the practices in place?
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember, for highlighting that. I think this is a big part of this conversation. We, as a city, and I've been working with the interim city manager, interim assistant city manager on how we can increase the number of cadets that we have going into our police academy. So it's really a twofold answer. The first is I need more cadets. I need more brand new officers coming into the academy. I also need to be able to retain the people that I have. And quite honestly, the second one is more important right now than the first one. The first one, they're both important, but I've got to spend a lot of time with my workforce, making sure that they feel supported, making sure that they understand that this is a great place to work and that they've got a bright future here, and hanging on to as many of those folks as I can. So we're working in both arenas. On the cadet side, we're offering a very substantial signing bonus right now that's competitive with other big cities. We're still, because we had opened many hiring cycles prior to the expiration of the contract, we can still go out of town and test, recruit, and do those things. And so we're doing that as well. I want to be able to put 100 cadets into each class. But the fact is that right now I'm putting about 35 to 40. And at that rate, and with the attrition rate that I have right now, I'm not making any progress on these vacancies. As a matter of fact, we're falling further and further behind every month. So we've increased the pace of cadet classes. We've increased our recruiting effort. And as a matter of fact, we're looking right now at a structural reorganization of APD to be able to have a commander that is just over recruiting, that is wholly dedicated to recruiting so that we can put even more effort into that. On the other side, I think that it has to do with, it comes down to making sure that leadership understands what we're trying to accomplish, that we are here for the citizens of Austin to help to elevate the intrinsic value of this profession, and particularly that Austin is a really great city. It's a great place to work, and it's a great place to live and raise a family. So hanging on to those officers is paramount to us as well.
Thank you.
Councilmember, if I could just add just a little bit to what Chief Chacon said, and it was in the information that was presented. Our officers have by and large been very positive about this experience. I think that has made their jobs easier. That's why they're able to respond to calls much faster. Their workload is incredible. When you have a 300-person vacancy, that is an incredible workload for the officers, the rank and file. And this additional officer contingent that DPS has provided us is really a relief for them. And I think in the end, that may help us with the attrition rate. And we need some help with the attrition rate because we need our officers to stay until we get these classes filled. And finally, what I'd like to say about the overall safety, I understand those comments that are made, and I've even heard it from my family members. The issue is that when you're in certain neighborhoods, some neighborhoods don't feel safe. And these call areas are from our citizens. These are the citizens that are calling saying, we need help. And when you can't respond in a timely way, that makes those areas of our city not feel safe. And so I think that's why this partnership is important. I think we've made some progress. I think we need to do the accountability that you just mentioned, and we intend to keep doing that through the Public Safety Committee.
Thank you, Manager. Councilmember Allison Alter, and then Councilmember Vela.
Thank you. I think that conversation leads directly to what I want to talk about. And before I raise some points, I want to state from the get-go that I believe that we need more officers than we have right now to keep our community safe. But I'm really interested in us thinking strategically. If we have a shared goal of improving our response time, of preventing crime, reducing and eliminating traffic fatalities, we have to think long-term. We have to think strategically. And I have some questions and thoughts that I want to ask about this strategy because I'm not sure it gets us to where we need to in the long term. I'm not sure it's sustainable in a way that our community will embrace or that we can afford or the state can afford. So I think we need to have a more strategic view. And I want to start by asking the city manager, actually, if we agree we want to improve response times, if we agree we want to prevent crime and we want to reduce traffic fatalities, how would we approach that from your one city angle? So you have said over and over again, we have to think as one city. We have to be taking these problems and thinking about it across departments and really honing in on how do we address the problem, more holistically. We ask a lot of our police officers. I think that's one of the problems over time. So if we took this one city kind of approach, we want to be collaborative, we want to have impact, we want to have accountability, we want to have transparency. What would be the other pieces here that are missing, and what are you doing in that regard?
Well, I think with respect to, there's some specifics that are just related to enforcement. I know in my own neighborhood, Southwest Austin, Southwest Parkway is a speedway. People move, they don't move at the 50-mile-an-hour speed limit, but they certainly move at 70 plus. I mean, you need to have some presence out there because sometimes with the amount of traffic on that roadway, it's ripe for some type of accidents that sometimes could result in injury. With respect to the issue of crime, you have to think in the terms of the long term. So what it is about economic development. What is it about the issues around behavioral health? It's a whole host of issues that you need to take into account. But it's not either or, it's both and. So you take the one side of the equation that needs to get done, that's a longer term approach, and then you've got to do the immediate enforcement approach. I think you do both of those hand in glove with one another, and you do it the way that at least using the call volumes in terms of the way we've responded to the patrols, that's an appropriate way because that's where we had the most demand for service that we weren't able to get to in a timely way. So I think we're trying to do as best we can with all the different tools in our toolbox. And I think there's another set of tools that I know that you mentioned to me the other day that I haven't had a chance to dive deep into, but we will. And we'll figure out how those pieces fit together so that we're cooperating across all departments in terms of what we're trying to get done.
So, Chief, how is APD engaging with the Office of Violence Prevention, and how is their expertise being used? You've talked about part of what we're using DPS for is to address gun violence, and the Office of Violence Prevention is one of these tools that we have that is not yet part of this conversation that needs to be part of the conversation. So can you speak to that?
Certainly. So really, when we talk about the DPS, there's In other words, there's two different sides to what we're talking about. There's what we can do preventatively, and then what we react to because it's already happened. And largely, the DPS, we're trying to prevent, but a lot of times they're reacting to something that has already happened. I've been working very closely with the district attorney's office and DA Garza with the Office of Violence Prevention on a couple of different efforts. The first being a violence intervention program that we are providing data so that they can try to do things that don't involve law enforcement to be able to interdict and to be able to intercede in that. And most recently, we are rolling out a program related to domestic violence with our youth. And how can we divert some of those type of cases away from the criminal justice system altogether in the heat of the moment? So we're talking as officers are arriving on the scene of family violence that involves a young person who is a juvenile, and being able to make a call to the district attorney to be able to divert that case right on scene. So it is a bit reactive, but at the same time, the Office of Violence Prevention is working with us on this to see what resources they can bring to bear, and so we've been working in that area.
Yeah, I can follow up on that with just a little bit of specifics. The project with the Office of Violence Prevention, and it's tied to the White House Violence Reduction Initiative, involves an outside organization called the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. And we have just cleared their personnel so that they can actually come to the police department. We're going to schedule it, start the scheduling process next week. They'll be coming, and what they'll be doing is sort of an independent analysis on everything related to gun crime, victimization, right? Victims, offenders, locations, times, places, et cetera. They'll use that information for OVP to begin a more aggressive, targeted community outreach to support one of the only empirically validated approaches to reducing gun crime, which really represents a partnership between social service organizations, police, and the community. And so we've been working pretty diligently with them to get that in place. The National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform finishing their first round of analysis is the first step to get started.
So I'm very much looking forward to. I will just point out it took well over a year to get the clearance and get them in the pipeline. I think we've got that addressed, but we need to have the same urgency about the prevention aspects and the violence prevention work as we do about having the troopers go out there. I thought you might have mentioned the work that's going on with the Givens Park Community Initiative. This is very much more emblematic of the one city approach where you have parks and watershed and APD, the DA and the county attorney all working together to address challenges of that community with that community. They're using environmental design for safety. As we're talking about these areas which have the violent crime in them, I think it would be really good if we could think about not just surging DPS officers, but surging the resources into those areas. Because what we're talking about with DPS is deterrence, and focused deterrence is not going to do anything beyond the short run. We really have to be talking about that long-term piece. So I wanted to make some of those points about the strategic part of how we're thinking about this and how we have to broaden it. And I think it's important when we're talking to the community that we don't lose sight of the work that we've been doing as a community to make people feel safe, which has many other dimensions, and there's a lot of good work being done. I think we, to understand whether this is fiscally sustainable and what it would mean, and also given the number of officers and the challenges recruiting, this may or may not be a sustainable approach. It's hard when we don't even know the number of troopers that are involved to really be able to understand, what we're talking about. Or do we have an extra 4 cars? Do we have an extra 20 cars of troopers? Like, we need to understand that basic thing. It's really, really challenging for us to make any statements. So we are going to need that kind of data. Is there a written agreement?
There is not a written agreement, no, ma'am.
Okay, so should we as a council, as Dallas did, decide we wanted to not be engaging DPS in this way. What is the exit strategy? What are the options for doing that? If there's no written agreement, how does that happen?
Well, I think that's probably a question maybe for the manager, or even the mayor, because I think they kind of initiated some of these conversations to begin with. DPS is being a good partner for us right now. We have talked about just a little bit how long this lasts, and the short answer is right now we just don't know. We're trying to give it time to work. We, as has been described, the initial deployment areas do not look like the deployment areas today, and we're seeing a dispersal of the violent crime calls that are coming in to 911 from those areas and prioritizing other parts of the city right now. I think that when we feel comfortable that we've essentially stabilized the situation, is when we're going to be having a discussion about whether DPS stops its deployment or not.
Okay, well, city manager, I think we need to, as a council, whether that's an executive session or here, I think we need to have a better and a fuller understanding of how this works. Should something happen, or should there be an issue, which hopefully there won't be, but I don't think we understand that at this point, absent a written agreement.
Yes, certainly, and we'll certainly provide that information, or actually we'll think through the process of how that works. I just want to emphasize again, and I guess I can't emphasize it. We're in a crisis situation with respect to staffing at APD. This isn't just would be nice to have. It's a must-have, and we don't have it, and we haven't had it for a while. And so this is one way, not a complete way, but it's one way of addressing it. And so before we begin to talk about what are the ways we pull the plug, give our officers time to catch their breath because of the type of work they've had to do over the last year or so with these number of vacancies. I'd ask you, give us that time, and then let's see what happens with the crime rate. Let's see what happens with traffic fatalities. Let's see what the successes would be before we start thinking about what's the exit strategy.
And I might just say that in all my conversations with folks at the Capitol that are related to what this partnership would look like, because there's been other discussions with people at the Capitol about the fact that we have this partnership. But one of the good things about it is we're not bound. We have the ability to make decisions with regard to length of time, how we want to go about doing things, much the same way that you're talking here. And it's also important to keep in mind, part of the context of all this is that DPS can work our streets regardless of whether there's a partnership that starts with the presumption that what they're doing is they're supporting and supplementing. And that's that. So what part of this agreement that sometimes gets lost is that it is the help that is needed, but it's done in such a way where APD is providing the data and doing the kinds of things to allow for supplement, support, and collaboration.
Thank you. I do have some other questions, and again, I think we still have an oversight role, as many of my colleagues have said, to ask questions, and we haven't had the benefit of being in some of those conversations, and this has really been the first opportunity for us to engage in that publicly at this point in time. So I think they're appropriate. I would like to know what happens and what rules does DPS follow if there are major protests as a city and as a council, and in terms of you, Chief, as the leader of APD, we have changed a lot of rules about how we respond to protests. It is not without possibility that we experience that, and I would like to understand what rules govern DPS if there are protests. We have said you can't use the rubber bullets and a lot of different things for crowd control. Help me understand what DPS would be doing in that.
Yeah, thank you. So just understand, please, just for context, that we're in the capital city, and particularly during session right now, we have protests essentially every weekend. There are protests that happen here. We have worked forever, it feels like, for many, many years, and quite honestly, decades with DPS jointly on managing peaceful protests. With regard to, their operational standards that they have as compared to APD, they have theirs and kind of we have ours. Ours have largely been shaped by events of the past, by council direction, by my direction as the chief on how we're going to handle it, and have been shared with DPS. And DPS, again, wants to be a good partner, understands what our direction in the city is. And in every instance that we worked previously has allowed us to take the lead on protests that occur outside of their jurisdiction. In other words, on Capitol grounds, they handle those, and we come in if necessary, and vice versa. So that generally has been how we've worked in the past, and we will continue to work in the future.
Okay, I think I may want to have more conversations with you on that. And then with respect to body cams and other kinds of oversight mechanisms, if a DPS officer is involved in an issue and there's body cam footage, what are the rules about disclosure there? And, if they're interacting with 911 or there's a need to see those interactions, what governs that situation?
So their policy would govern. And, I think we're talking about mainly critical incidents. So, if, for instance, they're involved in an officer-involved shooting, they would handle all of the administrative and criminal part of any critical incident that they're involved in. So Texas Rangers would be the investigative body, and then they have their own administrative investigation that occurs, as opposed to if one of my officers, then we have our process.
Thank you. Again, I think there's still some clarifications here that I'm hearing from folks that they want to understand better about how that is working, and I think it would be better to have that clear before any sort of incident happens, so that, and hopefully no incident will happen. I want to just go back to kind of where I started. We've been trying for a really long time to take a broader strategic view of how do we improve response times, how do we prevent crime, et cetera. And while in the short run, maybe, we do need more officers in the way that you're doing, I don't know. Just having more officers is not the only way to improve response times and prevent crime. And I want us, as we make these choices, which I hear from the city manager that he has particular reasons that he thinks this is important from an operational standpoint, we cannot lose sight of the fact that we have other tools, we have other things that our community has said are important for them to feel safe. We have other things that we recognize are going to allow our officers to do their jobs more effectively, allow them to focus on violent crime, allow us to retain them if they're not having to be everything to all people at all times. And we cannot lose sight of that as we move forward and we try and address this. I am not comfortable just saying, let's wait for 6 months and see how this plays out. We have an opportunity with new leadership to really be pushing on those other things and having the different departments work together. The Office of Violence Prevention should be working really closely with the police department, and in these areas, and trying to figure out how to design these crime intervention programs. When it's a park that we're talking about, PARD can be involved. We can use environmental design. What would happen if we put, we surged with those resources too? We have to be asking those questions, and I think our community is demanding that, and it is, I think, has to be part of the way forward. It is not sustainable to do this. We don't have a clear solution to the officers between recruiting, et cetera. So we should be making those investments now, so that we can really address the issues here in our community. Thank you.
Let me start actually with a question for the city attorney. What exactly is the jurisdiction of a DPS?
Actually, Chief Chacon got it exactly right in the beginning of the presentation. DPS has statewide jurisdiction by state law. They enforce the public safety laws and are tasked with detecting and preventing crime. So even before this robust or more intentional collaboration with DPS, they certainly had the authority to be here.
So regardless of, county line, city limits, DPS can and will enforce the law within the state of Texas.
That's correct.
And so implied within that is that DPS has the authority to pull people over in Austin, arrest people in Austin, again, regardless of any partnership or agreement with the city.
That's correct.
Chief, where is DPS filing their the tickets that they're issuing?
I believe if it is a moving violation in Justice of the Peace Court 5.
All right. So can they file in Austin Municipal Court?
I asked that question and it wasn't entirely clear to me. I think they made an operational decision to file them in JP5 for just to keep it
simple
and keep it smooth.
So from the city's perspective, then, we don't know where and how many the tickets are being filed because they're not being filed. And we can get that information from Austin Municipal Court, but if they're filing in JP5, we're going to have to ask JP5 to turn over that information.
Well, on their own, they have to collect the data because they have to file a racial profiling report every year, just like we do. So presumably they've got the data also. Municipal court generally for us does not provide that data. We may pull the data, the police department may, but that, I think largely you're correct.
So again, I'm just trying to think of the data, and I know that we've requested it from DPS, but just I don't know when or how long it'll take to get it, but the county attorney would have misdemeanor data in terms of arrests, for misdemeanor arrests. The district attorney would have felony data in terms of how many, DPS, and not just how many, but what and who are I think the pertinent questions. And then JP5 would essentially be, or potentially the other JPs. I'm not sure if it would only be JP5, but the other JPs would have the details in terms of the tickets. I think it's important that we get that as soon as possible, and I would hope that we can reach out to our county attorney, district attorney, and JPs to find out exactly what's going on and who's getting ticketed and who's getting arrested and for what. Those are extremely important questions for the public. I completely agree that again, your gun crimes, your violent crimes, those kinds of things like that, we've really got to crack down on that. Drug crimes, marijuana, very small, class, state jail felony level, possession of controlled substance crimes. Those are being declined prosecution at the DA level. I don't think that there's a grassroots kind of bubbling up to really hammer down on tiny amounts of pills or some kind of illicit drugs. So I think those are very important questions in terms of, I think, public support for the program. In terms of liability, which again has become more and more of an issue in terms of the payouts that we've made, if, again, God forbid, that there was some kind of serious incident involving DPS, who gets sued?
I'll answer it. DPS would be sued.
And in terms of disciplinary action, is DPS? I'm assuming that they are not covered by Chapter 143.
They are not.
So any kind of disciplinary, for example, the one complaint that the OPO forwarded over to DPS should be publicly available. Let me rephrase that. There is no confidentiality restriction or any kind of open records restrictions on the reports filed against DPS, is there?
Yeah, that's probably a question for DPS. I'm not too sure how they operate in that space.
My sense of it would be, as long as it's not a pending crime, as long as it's not a pending criminal investigation, that it would essentially be available to the public. So in some instances, in many instances, honestly, we may have more transparency into DPS, complaints filed against DPS, and the resolutions with regard to complaints filed against DPS than we do against APD. In terms of the data available to the public, that's been also, and in discussing DPS and the information that is out there, I know that there is your monthly report that is put out, which is just a monthly list of the arrests, number of arrests, type of arrests. Is that correct?
That's correct in the monthly report.
And then and please, again, my memory may not serve me well here, but I believe there's also a sector-by-sector report or something similar provided to the Public Safety Commission every month. Can you elaborate on that, or are you aware of that?
Yeah, so that's the quarterly report from the department, and so we provide some information is provided at the sector level. Most of it is actually summary information from at the city level. So in particular, we look at numbers of calls for service and response times by sector with them. But that process is driven primarily by discussion with them, and we're in the process of changing what information is going to be shared.
Okay. And I remember having a conversation, or my office had a conversation with Assistant City Manager Adriano a few months back, possibly a year back. But my understanding was that there was a data portal being developed, or that was in process, where we would be able to share more data with regard to, for example, calls for service, individual crimes, in terms of not just like a monthly kind of snapshot, but a kind of longitudinal analysis, so we can better see what's going on in terms of criminal activity.
So one of the department initiatives that I put in place upon getting here was after an evaluation of the data sharing portals that the city has available. We do not have adequate technology to put forth anything that I believe is sort of commensurate with the level of transparency that the city desires. Most of that is a technology issue. So we have been working on modifications to underlying data systems for about 2 years to try to bring us to a point where ultimately we can put forth a new portal. Now, you know that we have the current available applications, Crime Viewer, for example, which was developed by CTM, and it didn't have a lot of, at the time it was useful, but it didn't have the forethought to still be useful now. And so it gives some information, but it has challenges. There's the portal currently for APD incident reports, the incident report database. Similarly, that gives you some information, but it's not easy to summarize and kind of understand what's happening. So we are working toward a new system. It does involve still at this point substantial upgrades to one of our fundamental underlying databases, and I think the timeline on that's about 18 to 24 months. After that, then there'll have to be a substantial upgrade on one of the main servers at CTM to be able to support the amount of traffic we would expect. What we don't want to do is put forth a public portal solution that works when it's a few people looking for information, but anytime that there's actually an event that would likely draw a large crowd, we don't want it to crash. So again, there's a number of sort of fundamental steps we have to take to be prepared for a new system, and then we have to implement the new system.
So you said 18 to 24 month timeline on that, huh?
So that's on the underlying database that our major record system runs on. It was an out of service Oracle database that there was no support for. It was a huge IT risk. That's been now migrated to a current version of Oracle. If anyone's technically inclined, Oracle is unique, is the word I will use for it among databases. And so the CTM has to migrate that to some version of an SQL database in order for it to play well, if you will, with portal systems. At the same time, we're also working with the vendor on a cloud migration. So these things are happening parallel. Ultimately, which path we take determines our specifications for the portaling system. So that's where we're at with it.
And I appreciate that, and I bring it up because we consistently hear complaints, concerns with regard to the amount of data that is available. I mean, obviously, policing and public safety is a major topic of public concern, and working closely on Project Connect, a very similar situation where you have folks that are extremely knowledgeable and dedicated that want access to data so that they can run their own analysis and provide feedback both to the police department, to us as individual council members. I welcome their help and assistance, and sometimes they can really kind of ferret out little details that some of us may miss. And I would really, urge that, especially in light of like I said, the questions that are coming up. I know one of the questions has been kind of the call for service versus number of full-time police employees. What is that? Is it going up? Is it going down? The sector by sector analysis. Where are the calls for service? Per sector. I think releasing a robust data set. And again, I understand there's operational concerns. I'm not saying that we need to see where the police are in real time or anything like that. But a 3-month delay on it, or something like that to solve for any operational concerns, I think that would be very well received by the community and would be very helpful in helping us suss out public safety, policy guidance, those kinds of issues. And lastly, just a brief comment. I'm glad to hear there's a shifting balance there, because a lot of the feedback that I was getting from my constituents, particularly, I'll say in the Lamar-Runberg area, was that they were feeling over-policed. And I've been trying to kind of, go out and make sure to kind of just keep an eye on things. And there were a number of DPS officers, I'd say, aggressively patrolling that area. I don't know if that's still the case in terms of the week-by-week shifting that's going on. And again, I understand there are, serious concerns about safety, and we have to respond to those calls for service that come out. But there is that balance to be struck, where there is kind of a resentment, especially where, a lot of the stops are just patrol stops for, relatively minor traffic violations and tags and registrations and those kinds of things like that. So we need better data exactly to see what's going on. But I would just urge both APD and DPS to be extremely cautious and respectful of communities and their response to a swarm of cruisers stopping every single person that is going 35 and a 30 or something to that effect. But I do appreciate the briefing, and I look forward to learning more about the program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate the presentation. I and my team were fortunate to get to go to CTEC on Friday and go talk to some of the call takers and understand a little more how incoming 911 calls are triaged and how that system works. So it was really fascinating to get the opportunity to do that. I wanted to ask a question about dispatch. So, the calls come in, someone takes the call and identifies all the details and makes sure it's accurate before it goes to dispatch. Are they assigned at that point to an APD officer or a DPS officer by nature of the call, or is it just who is closest and can get there quickest?
Yeah, so none of the calls are being assigned to DPS officers. If there's no APD officers that are available, they will sound the call out, say there's a call holding at this location, and then it's on DPS to go ahead and volunteer for the call. So we're not assigning them, and as DPS troopers are, even because we don't know necessarily what they're doing at that moment because they're not in our CAD system, for us to be able to even assign them, we are relying on them to either be available or make themselves available to go take that hot call, to, like I said, stabilize the scene until APD can arrive.
And are those mostly the highest urgency calls as opposed to the lower urgency calls?
That's correct.
Or lower priority, if that's the right terminology.
Yes, that is, and that's correct.
Thanks. And then I was curious, in the memo that came out on the 13th, there was mention of 25 handguns and 2 of the shotgun rifle style guns. How does one determine that they need to be confiscated, given that Texas seems to make it easier for people to get a hold of guns at younger ages at times? How is it determined that they need to be confiscated?
So there's a couple of different reasons why they might be confiscated. The first is that if you are not legally allowed to own a weapon because of your criminal background, which they can determine at that time, then that weapon will be seized. If it is used in the commission of an offense, then it will be seized. Or if it's in your possession while you're committing some other crime, then that can be an enhancer and they will be seized. So it just depends on the circumstances.
Okay, that's helpful. And I do remember when some of these conversations have happened at the statewide level, public safety has oftentimes gone and said, you might be making our jobs harder because sometimes folks shouldn't be able to access weapons so easily, especially if they have a history of violent crime and domestic violence and things of that nature. As far as the list of arrests and warrants, are those numbers mutually exclusive or are they different?
I believe that they are We're not talking about the same.
Or is there overlap?
Yeah, those are new charges versus old charges that are in the form of a warrant.
Okay. Okay, that's helpful. And as far as traffic stops, are those completely separate from everything else that might be on the list? And is there a breakdown of what types of traffic stops have been conducted?
So there is no breakdown of the types of traffic stops, and I think that's some of the information that's being asked for, along with other information related to the stops. But that is a standalone category, and it might be happening as part of either part of that initiative, part of the violent crime initiative, or part of the traffic safety initiative.
Okay. Okay, that's helpful. And I also think, Mayor, when you had stepped away, there was a request from Councilmember Harper Madison about being able to talk with DPS as well in future conversations. There was mention of it going to Public Safety Committee.
I think that's,
I don't know if that's the appropriate venue or if it needs to be a different work session, since I'm sure we're all curious about the details.
well, what I'll do is what we had talked about was bringing it to the Public Safety Committee, again, back to the idea about how we've been trying to figure out how best to utilize committees. And since we post those anyway, anybody can come, and I will make sure as chair of the committee that when we're having reports like this, which will probably be the next time we have a report, I'll make sure everyone is aware through the message board and shouting it from mountaintops that people are invited and come so that we can have this kind of robust discussion.
I think that's helpful. And I've got one more question for the chief on the gun topic, if it doesn't slip out of my mind. Oh, when they're confiscated, do they become property of DPS, or does APD take them within the city limits? How does that process work?
So I mentioned that briefly earlier, but just to clarify, every weapon that is seized by DPS, they do not want to hang on to that gun. They want it to go, if it's related to a crime that is occurring here in Travis County or Hayes or Williamson, whatever county it is in the city, then it will be maintained and controlled by APD. And then upon disposal of the criminal case, it will fall back under our disposal policy for that weapon. So they don't want to transport those weapons back to their home jurisdictions.
Okay, that's helpful to know, because I was just curious. I think we're all kind of learning a little bit about how does APD's jurisdiction versus DPS's jurisdiction work, and trying to understand how this is going to function. And my last point to the city manager's point about Southwest Parkway being essentially a highway. We had tried to start a conversation about allowing more either constables or sheriffs to be doing work inside the city limits on specifically traffic enforcement. There was a case on Slaughter Lane in Circle C recently where a 19-year-old person was going 90 miles an hour and the car ended up in a tree. So the speeding is a huge concern. We don't want people pulled over for, small things. We don't want people to feel like they're being unfairly targeted. But I will just say, especially in Southwest Austin, people are commonly going 90 or 100 miles an hour on the highway. And so if it is for speeding, aggressive driving, things like that, I can say that the Southwest community by and large supports trying to make sure that people are being respectful of the road and respectful of their neighbors, given how dangerous that type of behavior is. So we've been trying to tackle that for at least a year now, trying to come up with creative solutions. And so there are some portions of this that I think are going to make some people safer, but we have to be very mindful of the perception of safety. And I know some folks have mentioned to me just the terminology about how people feel safe and how we as policymakers do that. And there are some folks that feel safe when there's police around, and there's folks that don't feel safe because police are around. And we need to be very sensitive to that because our community has asked us to be responsive. But thank you for your answers.
Thank you.
Councilmember Harper Madison, I think I saw you with your hand up. Do you wish to be recognized? I believe you're still on mute.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mayor. It turns out that our Mayor Pro Tem asked all my questions.
Very good. Thank you. Councilmember Poole, do you wish to be recognized?
I guess I would just kind of encapsulate all of the comments and the questions and the information that we've gotten today. as really helpful throughout for everyone, not just us sitting here and folks at the city, but also the residents. I think that the information sought, Councilmember Vella, I think you used the word balanced, and we're looking for that in the community. There are people who are looking for and asking for a presence from our police department, and we all want that to be the appropriate presence. And so I think when we balance out the needs of the community on both sides of the question, then we will get to the right place. And I think, Mayor, that the conversation that we're having here on these issues is really going to help us get there, and also for everyone in the public to understand how hard we're working in order to achieve that balance. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Yes. Very good, robust conversation. Yes. Okay. Yes. Councilmember Ryan Alter.
I just have one follow-up question on some of the other. When we talked about overtime, how is DPS presence affecting our use of overtime? Are you scaling back in any way? Is it the same?
No, it's the same, council member.
Okay.
We have not scaled back on our backfill on the number of overtime officers that we're having to hire. So they're just a supplement.
Okay. And whenever, if I assume you're going to get some requests from various offices for data, if you wouldn't mind sharing that with all the offices or through the, I figure, but just.
Members, thanks for the robust discussion and all the questions. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here and